This module on the nature of science. And in this unit, we're going to look at the criteria for defining science. So we're going to go through some characteristics which I think could be helpful in basically categorizing science from non-science. But again, they are limited in their scope in that we're just trying to get some accessible ideas, but they're not the only ones. So that's really important to emphasize. So how can we tell science from non-science? Why is something scientific and something else is not scientific? So the following criteria may be useful to incorporate in the classroom to illustrate some fundamental differences between science and the other disciplines. And like I just said, it's one way of classifying science. It's not the only way. So we know that the discipline of science is a human construction. So these are just some characteristics that generally typify the scientific endeavour. So we're going to look at 6, and they are consistency, observability, natural, predictability, testability, and tentativeness. So consistency. So what is it? So consistency generally refers to this type of phenomena. So the results of repeated observations and or experiments concerning a naturally occurring event or phenomenon are reasonably the same when performed and repeated by competent investigators. Now there's a lot of parts in that where we can go, oh, but this is different and this is an exception. But in general, that's what consistency means when we're talking about science. So for example, which of the following is a scientific statement and which one is not? So out of these two, have a look at them. So green plants will grow towards a light source. Walking under a ladder will cause bad luck. Which one do you think? So can we test both of those for consistency? So we could probably do experiments with green plants and repeat those and see if our results are pretty much the same if they're performed by different people at different times in different environments. Whereas walking under a ladder will cause bad luck. Well, we'd have to define what bad luck is. Could we test that? Okay, could we repeat that and get the same types of results? So probably not. So the first is a scientific statement and the second isn't. Observability. So the event under study or evidence of the occurrence of the event can be observed and explained. Now that doesn't mean that we just see things. Our senses involve sight, hearing, taste, touch, smell. So we can observe using any of those senses. But basically we can use our basic human senses or extensions of the senses by things such as microscopes, Geiger counters, etc. So we can use technology to help us make those observations. If the phenomenon cannot be reproduced through controlled conditions, natural evidence of the evidence occurrence must be available for investigation. So let's have a look at another 2 statements. So which one's scientific and which one's not? Some plants eat insects. Extraterrestrial beings have visited Earth. Now, we can observe that plants eat insects. Could we possibly repeat that observation and see consistently over time so we can relate to the first characteristic that plants eat insects? Not all plants eat insects, but some do. Extraterrestrial beings have visited Earth. Can we basically perform controlled conditions to investigate that? Okay, yes, there's some anecdotal evidence of that, but we can't actually repeat and reproduce that particular phenomenon to investigate it scientifically. Okay, natural. A natural cause or mechanism must be used to explain why or how the naturally occurring event happens. So what does that mean? So scientists are not able to use supernatural explanations as to why or how naturally occurring events happen because reference to the supernatural is outside the realm of science. Now when we talk about supernatural, we tend to be talking about religious connotations such as the idea of a god being able to create the earth. So what this one's about is that we can't actually use that type of explanation for events in science. It doesn't mean that the religious view is not honoured, but it means that in the scientific enterprise that is not something that we could use as a characteristic of science. So here's another set of statements. Green plants convert sunlight into energy. With a rod, Moses parted the sea so his people could cross to the other side. Now, this one, green plants convert sunlight into energy. Again, a natural cause can be used to explain why that happens. So we can talk about photosynthesis, the process of photosynthesis, which actually enables this to occur. With this one, there's no natural explanation for how he could do that. So we know that with a rod, based on the laws of physics, you couldn't part such a large volume of water using that. So again, that's what we're talking about, is that there's no natural cause or mechanism for this to occur. Again, it's not to say that the religious worldview is incorrect. It just means that it doesn't fit within the realms of the scientific enterprise. So it's really important to make sure that point's made with your students, particularly in religious schools. Predictability. The natural cause or mechanism of the naturally occurring event can be used to make specific predictions. Each prediction can be tested to determine if the prediction is true or false. And that's not to say that the knowledge is true or false, but whether the prediction holds as true or false. So removing light will cause green plants to die. Here's one. If you're a Scorpio, your horoscope for today is, you'll be saying, I feel rich. Lunar position highlights back pay, refunds, and correction of accounting error. Now, predictability means, could we predict removing light will cause green plants to die? So we can test that. And after a number of tests, we can find that every time we do that, green plants die. So we can make a prediction that if we remove light, green plants will die. This one, how would we put something into test to be sure that this could occur? So would we have to test all Scorpios to make sure that they actually did get back pay, refunds, or correction of accounting error? No, it's not a predictable statement. Science is generally testable. Now, not all realms of science do specific tests or experimentation. Again, some of our more observational sciences, but it is a hallmark of science that we can use controlled experimentation to test. So the natural cause or mechanism of the naturally occurring event must be testable through the processes of science, with controlled experimentation being utilised in most cases. Reference to supernatural events or causes are not relevant tests. So here's one. The Bermuda Triangle causes ships and planes to sink and disappear. Green plants need light to survive. Now, could we test that first one? Could we test it? I guess we could. We could go to the Bermuda Triangle, but how do we control? So if one ship gets through out of 5, does that mean that that holds true? If 4 ships out of 5 comes through, does that mean it's true? I mean, it's not a testable phenomenon. We can't hold something constant and then vary something else and do a fair test, whereas we can with the second statement. And the final one, tentativeness. Scientific theories are subject to revision and correction, even to the point of the theory being shown to be wrong. Scientific theories have been modified and will continue to be modified to consistently explain observations of naturally occurring events. Okay, so science is changeable. Theories are changeable. The number of human chromosomes was once known to be 48, but it's now considered to be 46. We know that the world began about 6,000 years ago, and nothing will change that. Okay, so both of those statements, one, we're actually showing evidence of the fact that we have changed. So yes, 48 was the recorded number, but now we have more information, better technology, and we're not going to say we know it to be 46, but we can be very confident that it's 46. Again, we use tentative language in science. We know the world began about 6,000 years ago, and nothing will change that. That's a form of creationism or a creationist view. And basically, creationists will hold firm to that view. So there's no tentativeness involved at all with that viewpoint. It's not able to be changed according to people that align with this view. It's more of an absolute type view. So they're characteristics that we're going to use as saying, well, that defines something as being fairly scientific. There's other types of science which you might have heard of, like emerging sciences or proto-sciences. And we can call these near sciences. So they tend to conform to most of the criteria on the previous slides, but typically fall short in one or more of the criteria. So a proto-science differs from a science in that consistent observations and predictions may be limited by either our human knowledge or by technology or some combination of both. So parapsychology, things like mental telepathy, clairvoyance, they could be considered an emerging science. There's some aspects of science in there, but there's some things that don't really line up, and particularly in the area of making predictions and having consistent observations. So scientists generally consider parapsychology a pseudoscience, which we're going to talk about shortly, because its phenomena conflict with known physical laws. But things like mental telepathy, are really on scientists' radar because there's a number of aspects of that particular discipline area that do fit the criteria for science. A non-science, on the other hand, is an area of knowledge that doesn't meet the criteria for science. So it could be a very logical area, could be based on good reasoning, but it doesn't fall within the realms of science. So things like philosophy, religion, ethics, these are all not scientific, but they're very valid disciplines in their own right. What's a false science? So when we said pseudoscience before, that falls into the false science category. Now, a false science may be defined as a non-science, which we talked about earlier, but it's portrayed and advertised as a legitimate science by its followers and supporters. So astrology is a really good example of a pseudoscience. Other examples are acupuncture, alchemy, cold fusion, astrology, which I think we just said, eugenics, homeopathy, iridology, naturopathy, reflexology. So those are still within the realms of what we could call a pseudoscience, even though many have aspects of scientific criteria in them. They are portrayed as legitimate sciences, so that's where the difference lies. So you can find a summary of these criteria in reading 3, which gives us an overview of all of those different criteria. And like I said, it's just a way of finding some characteristics of science. It's not the only way of doing it, but it gives you some sense of the differences. So let's have a look now at different theories of evolution, because this really portrays really nicely some of the differences between science, emerging science, non-science, etc. So we know a theory is a very well substantiated explanation for an event or a phenomenon. So creationism. So how did life on Earth come into existence? A number of views have been put forward and they've changed over time. So creationism is the view that's held by a certain group in society where God created all life on Earth. Spontaneous generation was another view about how life comes to exist. The idea that living things can appear from non-living things, and this idea has been scientifically debunked. Evolution of organisms from pre-existing life. So the idea that single-celled organisms give rise to multicellular organisms. So jellyfish become fish, fish become amphibians, etc. Again, not a view that we hold in science. And the final one, genetic variation and the environment cause change in organisms. So this is Darwinian evolution, which is the currently accepted view in science for how life came to exist, or evolution. So interestingly, over time, these ideas have modified and changed. So not that very long ago, around about 400 years ago, very few people believed in scientific theories to explain creation. So the scientific worldview was not the dominant one. The religious worldview was very dominant. So most people believed that God created heaven and earth, and he created all living things on earth separately from each other. So that was the dominant view. And God created humans, and all other living things were inferior to humans. Okay, so it was a very superior view that man was the dominant in the universe, not just on Earth, but in the whole universe. Many people believe that the Earth and all life on it were fixed and permanent, so they didn't have a tentative view. And as a result of creation, all organisms appeared on the Earth at the same time, and the Earth itself was about 6,000 years old. And we know that this is very much not the view now that is held in the scientific community. It's not to say that you or your students can't believe in a religious worldview, but as far as science goes, we don't tend to believe in this sort of supernatural explanation. So we're going to look at the theory of evolution and how those ideas have changed, and we're going to look at Darwinian evolution because that's our currently held view. It's just got a little hyperlink here.
What is Charles Darwin's theory of evolution? Let us not get controversial, but simply stick to the facts about Charles Darwin and his theory of evolution. An English naturalist, Mr. Darwin definitely gave us all a lot to think about. Darwin's theory of evolution actually contains two major ideas. The first idea posed by Mr. Darwin theorized the idea that evolution occurs. In other words, organisms change over time, and life on Earth has changed as descendants diverged from common ancestors in the past. The second idea from Mr. Darwin is that evolution occurs by natural selection. Natural selection is the process in which living things with beneficial traits produce more offspring than others. This results in changes in the traits of living things over time. In Charles Darwin's day, the early 1800s, most people believed that all species were created at the same time and remained unchanged thereafter. They also believed that the Earth was merely 6,000 years old. Darwin's ideas revolutionized biology as we know it. How did Mr. Darwin come up with these important ideas? It all started when he went on a voyage. In 1831, when Darwin was just 22 years old, he set sail on a scientific expedition on a ship called the HMS Beagle. He was the naturalist on the voyage. As a naturalist, it was his job to observe and collect specimens of plants, animals, rocks, and fossils wherever the expedition went ashore. Darwin was fascinated by this nature, and his job on the Beagle was the most important time of his life. He spent over 3 years of the 5-year trip exploring nature on distant continents and islands. While he was away, a former teacher published Darwin's accounts of his observations. By the time Darwin finally returned to England, he had become famous as a naturalist. During the long voyage, Charles Darwin made many observations that helped him form his theory of evolution. Some of what he found included tropical rainforests and other new habitats where he saw many plants and animals he had never seen before. An earthquake that lifted the ocean floor 9 feet, 2.7 meters, above sea level. He also found rocks containing fossil seashells in mountains far above sea level. These observations suggested that continents and oceans had changed dramatically over time and continue to change dramatically. Rock ledges that had clearly once been beaches that had gradually built up over time. This suggested that slow, steady process also changed the surface of the Earth. Fossils of gigantic extinct mammals, such as the ground sloth. This was hard evidence that organisms looked very different in the past, as it suggested that living things, including the Earth's surface, change over time.
Okay, so that was a really interesting little clip about Charles Darwin. So, as was stated on the video, this whole idea that scientists began to question creationist views, and this idea that the age of the Earth was only 6,000 years old and that everything was fixed, were challenged. So Charles Darwin's work, which inferred that some characteristics helped organisms survive and reproduce, and that favourable characteristics would be passed on, and over time groups of organisms would gradually change. This idea, though, that it took millions of years for this change to happen, he was putting forward in his theories, but he couldn't test his theories. He could only collect evidence to support his views. So it was really quite difficult. So evolutionary biology is a really interesting area because in our sort of experimental disciplines like chemistry and physics, we can go and directly test things, but other types of scientific subdisciplines, such as evolutionary biology, those types of tests are not possible. So his ideas were really controversial, and his theory of natural selection that he put forward, he was able to propose a process to explain how evolution occurred. Okay, so it was an explanatory context. He claimed that humans, like other organisms, developed because of evolution. Now, obviously, this was not very popular at the time because, like I said, in those sort of times, the religious worldview was the dominant one. So scientific ideas that sort of flew in the face of religion were not accepted. So over time, Charles Darwin had quite a difficult time. He took 20 years before he published his seminal work, which was The Origin of Species. But, he was quite a religious man himself, and his wife was very religious. So you can see that human element in this story is that, scientists actually are human, and they actually have to practice their science within society, and there are constraints. So we know that Darwinian evolution is the currently accepted theory of evolution in the majority of Australian schools. But interestingly, there's quite a bit of debate, particularly in the US, about these types of views. So just to reiterate, creationism generally refers to the idea that a supernatural being created the universe and all life on Earth. A sort of morphed idea from that is this idea of intelligent design, or ID. It's considered to be a type of creationism whereby certain features of the universe and living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, i.e. like a god, but not from an undirected process such as natural selection. So proponents of intelligent design just cannot accept that all of this could have happened without some sort of god starting it all. So a lot of ID proponents don't believe in the 6,000-year-old Earth. They have views that are more aligned to a scientific view, recognising that these processes take millions of years. However, they still hold to the view that God must have started it all. It couldn't have just been an undirected process. So ID supporters propose that intelligent design is a valid scientific theory because it has many aspects that align with science, but this whole idea that there is a supernatural component makes it somewhat problematic. So the inclusion of the teaching of intelligent design is a hotly debated topic in the United States because in some states in the United States, Darwinian evolution is not taught. It's removed from textbooks because of the religious underpinnings of many people in those states. So there's no mandate in the US, Europe, or the UK for the inclusion of the topic of intelligent design or creationism in science, but the topic can certainly be included in social science, history, and philosophy classes in some countries. And look, I think it's a great topic to talk about in science, not to put it forward as science, but to actually discuss the differences so students can see the differences between something we define as science and something we define as a non-science or even a pseudoscience, depending on where you sit with it. So the activity I'd like you to do from this rather long unit is to access your reading 4, which is called Teaching Evolution and the Nature of Science. It's a great article. It talks about the context of evolution in US schools, which is so interesting. I'd really like for you to consider the questions I've put there about your views and whether you think Darwinian evolution should be compulsory, which it generally is, other than if you're in a particularly religious school, like some of the Islamic schools, but it's part of our Australian curriculum. So does the teaching of Darwinian evolution negate or go against the biblical account? How do deeply religious students react to Darwinian evolution? And you may be deeply religious, so it's really important to reflect on your views. And you have to consider that sometimes for deeply religious students, this is the first time sometimes that many of them have heard that their creationist type views may not be accepted or by society. So for some students, this can be quite a confronting topic. So it's really important. It comes up in around about year 9, 10 in the Australian curriculum. So unless you're teaching into that junior secondary context, you probably won't have to deal with the direct teaching, but think about how those students might react to hearing this kind of information and how that's going to make them feel. Add your views to the discussion board, and we will now move to our final unit in this module.